So there's this game called Humankind, and it draws some inevitable comparisons to the Civilization series. Let's explore how these games differ, sticking to mechanics, aesthetic, and design. Talking about the comparative ideologies of these games would be like its own entire video. To start off, I'll say this. Humankind is not an indie take on Civ. I'm not saying this as someone who went into it with that assumption. I knew up front that it was going to be structured a lot more like Endless Legend. But I thought I'd lead in with a refutation of what has been a common comparison. They occupy the same setting and genre, and I guess both use hexagons. Actually, I wouldn't even refer to Humankind as like Civ. Aesthetically, more than a few surface things make it feel that way, but then, in practice, there's so much nuanced deviation that it really is its own game. Civ doesn't own the right to symmetrical historical strategy, and it feels great to have a fresh face in this niche of games. Humankind is a turn-based historical strategy game that takes place across the span of human history from the Neolithic era to the present. Okay. So far, that sounds a bit like Civ, but there's already a huge deviation. They've reached into territory Civ more or less can't. Pre-civilization, the nomadic Neolithic era. For those familiar with Civ, it's played like the ancient era, where you're sending scouts out everywhere to explore and find ruins, but with a big twist that comes in two parts. 1. Humankind doesn't have settlers in the Civ sense. Your scouts, and indeed any unit, can claim territory. And 2, instead of barbarians and goody huts, you hunt down animals and forage to increase population that carries on to the next phase or era. Put those two together, and you get something interesting that really sets it apart from Civ in the traditional symmetrical start model. You get a sense of your surroundings before you commit to anything, from city location to your starting culture. And that's how one twist becomes a spiral, creating a wholly different shape. Let's look at Humankind by exploring what a few turns of it are like. By turn 40 or so, you'll have a grasp on all the ways the game is different. The first 15 turns are that aforementioned Neolithic era, exploring the world to some extent, learning the terrain where your neighbors are. At some point, you may have gotten into a fight with an animal and chosen not to auto-resolve. And that's where you learn that combat is more tactical than Civ. Your stack of units fan out and use the terrain that they were on and or near for an enclosed turn-based combat. This might also be the first time you notice elevation and the way it plays into the game. High ground is a good way to reliably beat a mammoth, and if you manage it, you'll get another unit. Once you've decided where you want your people to live, it's pretty much time to pick a culture, entering the ancient era. Imagine if you could decide 15 turns deep into a Civ round who you wanted to be. No more getting the perfect Russia start when you're playing England. After that, it's time to grow and claim more territory via outposts, which can either become cities or link their yields to cities. You'll see that territory is claimed in preordained regions. Each region can only have one city. Looking at the city window, you'll see that resources are gathered from every hex that is adjacent to the center automatically, and that population fills out jobs. Think of it like if, instead of specialist slots, you had farmers, laborers, merchants, and researchers from the start, getting more slots by adding districts, which also extend the reach of your city's resource acquisition. Soon, you'll be presented with the option to spend influence, the final resource, other than food, industry, money, and science, on things ranging from claiming new territory to claiming the right to build a wonder. In Humankind, you reserve them in advance. Think of influence as weaponizable culture, more actively spent than passively exuded. It's also far more influential, than tourism is, both for more of the game and in terms of broader necessity. You can't just ignore it. So far, the game might not sound very different, but bear in mind how big a culture shift is and what it brings with it. If you're looking for a synergistic example in Civ terms, it would be like being Egypt for the ancient era and then pivoting to the Greeks for the classical era. Or you could even transition between historically disparate cultures with different worldly goals, go from Nubian traders to Hunnic conquerors. Those are the core elements of what makes Humankind different, as seen in just the first 40 turns. If that sounds interesting to you already, maybe give it a shot. From here on, I'm going to give my own impression of the game, so if you want to go in without me spoiling elements of it, now would be a good time to get off this wild ride. The point here is not to make an argument or comparison of strict quality, but to highlight the differences between these two games and largely introduce Humankind. Humankind is a lot more about rolling with punches, adapting, where Civ has none of that. On some level, it's really freeing because I don't know what perfect is, at least not yet. I can't become disappointed at a suboptimal circumstance because I don't super know them yet, and the game lets you pivot how you want. The Neolithic era changes a ton about the game in that it more or less removes the okay, need to re-roll issue that, even if you're not a perfectionist, plagues Civ. Culture shifts allow for similar dynamic and reactive play. However, I can't say whether I think this is a cure for Civ's sickness or if it almost makes it worse in a way. Instead of wonders, you could be beat out to culture shifts. That system, shifting cultures, is obviously a drastic departure from Civ, but also possibly the most iffy. On some levels, it's great and allows for a wholly new narrative freedom where Civ's freedom lacks narrative. But it also kind of horseshoes around. It has as many options as Civ, but the lack of limitation on culture shifting makes culture almost as ungrounded and ill-defined as in Civ. Instead of the Cree are this timeline's Britain, we get the Zhao culture shifted into becoming the Greeks. Eventually, one might settle on a favorite, or indeed a few favorite, cultural roadmaps, so to speak. But I think versatility is really the key to an interesting game here. Sure, you can plan for an ideal setup of some kind, but it could be spoiled in the same way Civ has wonders that get swiped. But a strategy isn't very good if it aggressively relies on being perfect or has no contingencies. We'll get to it later, but there's a point where this dynamic play rubs up against how victory works, and the results are iffy. Speaking to vision and aesthetics, it looks very pretty. Frankly, I find Civ 6 to be a bit ugly as a game. I know on some level they're going for the cartoonify it slightly and it'll be timeless thing, but when you find an area of contiguous land with minimal features, you'll see how ugly the game can get. A Plains Hill region looks awful, and there's like barely any variety in depictions of a given terrain. So when something repeats without interruption via a river or forest, it just looks bad. Humankind is different in that respect, partially because it has so many more tile modifiers and they're tied to terrain. It's similar to Civ's bonus resources in that they improve a tile, but aren't luxury or strategic or stockpiled in any way, just a yield boost. But they add a fair bit of variety. Height levels also have a strong aesthetic impact, and you may not even immediately notice. Civ has one height and then impassable mountains. Humankind gains a lot by simply allowing some verticality. The game ultimately leaves me a bit conflicted. For every up, there's a down. As natural and fluid as gameplay can be, it sometimes feels like cultures are just thrashing about. Music and architecture and even visual ethnic traits like skin color and unit portraits and stuff change with your culture, so it's kind of like a soft narrative reset in that way. You aren't really playing the what if of what if the Zhao dynasty culturally shifted into something that was like the Greeks but still Chinese. You literally become Greek, not a Chinese version of them or whatever. I didn't think that would bother me as much as it did, and maybe that sounds bad, but I kept kind of thinking of the Chinese Confucian style of my first era and imagining my people as Chinese even as eras progressed and I was Swedish by the end. I was attached to the original aesthetic. Optimal play doesn't mirror history in the slightest, and indeed has few chances to. We can't chart the historical path that would lead to becoming the Soviets. There's gaps or no real starting point at times. On the one hand, that's fine. It would be a narrower game in terms of cultural representation if they stuck to only nations that became the UN Security Council or whatever. But on the other hand, it removes another element of historical grounding. You're just picking cultures from a hat, and once you pick one, the other people can't. It doesn't matter what you were beforehand. Without going too far into making up my own take on it, I guess my solution would be some measure of branching paths, perhaps via cultural similarity and regional connection. I'm not saying you would have to sequester cultures geographically, but maybe make some manner of cultural continuum. Strangely, what I was reminded of most was how I just couldn't get invested in matches of Civ Beyond Earth, maybe for similar reasons. It's hard to imagine the cultures of this world. They share names, shorthands with history, but they feel a bit hollow. On some level, I wonder if the game would be better if it was full fantasy, like Amplitude's other titles. On another, I think it would expose how this game still falls in the pit of near symmetrical play that Civ has. Amplitude can be more creative. They've done so in the past. It's just sad to see their attention to detail get a bit washed out by the necessity of having 60 cultures, instead of a dozen or so truly distinct factions or whatever. The ethos system and the ability to change individual civics through cultural osmosis, influence, etc., that's all a really neat system, but it is also unfortunately the only place where I've seen what I'd call bugs. The experience is dampened a bit by what I assume are mistakes, contradictory civic results, choosing the freedom option and sliding to autocracy. Civ and games like it are addictive. That's why the famous one more turn button exists for after the game ends, and Humankind has that too. It's just, the end is strange and abrupt. One game I played said there were infinite turns until the cutoff point, and I checked semi-often, and then suddenly I got a notice that Brazil entered the last era and the game will end in one turn. Which, I had been in said era, if I understand correctly, for a long time. I don't know what triggered the conclusion. Now, as for winning and losing, this game doesn't have explicit paths to victory. Each player is expected to be a bit of a generalist, sticking to an extreme of cultural focuses, as in only being science cultures for the whole game, would probably be suboptimal on a base level, but also lead to a mediocre score. At best, you might just force the game to end quicker and hope you're ahead when it happens, because score is all there is with respect to winning. In some ways, that's freeing. It becomes a free-form general story of time and change and all that, and you don't have to mega focus on your thing. It encourages experimentation with culture combos. But also, that could mean the development of very dry metas where players stick to ideal paths in culture picks, throwing out the dynamic play. Of course, this is affected by balance, but unlike modifiers for cultures and bonuses, I don't think victory itself would ever be massively overhauled. Okay. On to the last section. Here's a question that I think encapsulates my frustration with the culture system. Why does Sweden emerge as a culture in the contemporary era? I can kind of justify some of the other cultures either via their global relevance or post-industrial emergence in the real world. India and China would be examples of both. America is more on the side of relevant superpower here, and the Soviets are a post-industrial culture, but why Sweden? Sweden doesn't have some post-industrial culture shift or societal change like the Soviets. The Swedish state of the 1900s is the same as the 1700s, the same state as from 1523 when it became independent from Denmark. If I asked what uniquely Swedish military unit existed, people would probably say the Karelian or something. But since it's not in that era, we instead get stealth corvettes, like sneaky boats. Okay. The unique building is a research institute, as though those don't exist the world over and probably predate the Swedish academic boom of the 60s. I'm not saying the game has to copy Civ or it's wrong, just that it leaves something to be desired here. Civ has always had debates over who gets in, who should represent them, and what their uniques should be. Disagreements or not, I think people tend to get why the choices were made. For example, Germany having the Hansa in the latest game is fine, and while U-boats aren't my first choice for a unique unit, it's something inarguably German. I can't guess as to why they chose the units, districts, or even cultures that they did. Relevance to an era doesn't seem to be why. Most contemporary age ones are world powers in some way, but some are just, why modern Egypt? Why Australia? In fact, settler nations are a strange addition on the whole to me. It's a bit odd to transform into them. On another level, it gives them a cultural legacy when historically they're more new than they are transformed. But I don't know how else they might put America into the game, so I don't know. It's genuinely just a bit odd, or at least highlights the broader oddity of these free-floating lineageless cultures in the pool. The game tries to decenter the West and does a pretty good job, all things considered. One small thing I've complained about before regarding Civ is the Renaissance era, which this game instead calls the far more neutral early modern era. The representation, who gets into Humankind, is starting out broad, where Civ, for the first few games, had a roster just shy of being half Western in each game. But I think this is still a place where Humankind falls apart a bit. I know in the past I've said that the Eurocentrism of Civ was a detriment, and I stand by that still. The issue here is that as we approach the modern era of cultures, like with the Sweden example, the culturally distinct district/unit options are no longer ones truly unique to their cultures. And it's probably because the real-world modern age is a world where nations and people westernized. So, the end result is cultures like China and Turkey having unique districts that are Congress and public school, respectively. As for units in specific, the contemporary era includes the Second World War, but not all the nations represented had some distinct unit involved in that, or indeed any modern conflict. So while the Soviets get Red Army tank, others get stuff like peacekeepers, free officers. Without context, you might have no guess who those belong to. I mean, would you guess that Turkey's unit is a cruise missile? And now, one could probably make an argument for all these things being a bit specialized by their cultural owners, but compared to, say, Kothons for Carthage or Confucian schools for Zhao, British redcoats, etc., it stands out in how little they stand out. I love the ideas of this game on paper a ton. Decoupling history from great men, from immortal avatars, appeals to me. I think if you can unshackle yourself from history and your internal understanding of what these cultures are, it can be a fun story. It just loses a bit of magic by being ungrounded, because the cultures aren't allowed their natural vibrancy. I guess I could take the Aztecs to be what they were in real life, but it's hard to do that when I was just the Mycenaeans, and I'll have to shift again soon. In an ironic twist, it muddies cultures and people with the states that represent them. I'd almost say a lot of the game is about letting go, doing good, not optimal, not perfect, just living the history, not freaking out about how perfectly placed everything can be. The game does fix a lot of Civ complaints. It doesn't have any of the missteps of Civ 6 in specific, and I'm always thankful for that. And it doesn't have some of the legacy issues Civ has, like dry combat. I was genuinely surprised when the game approached secularism as more than just a drop in tourism. Even the future tech feels less egregious, since it's a capstone for ending the game, reaching just past what we're able to do in our own era. The Neolithic Age alone does a lot to help smooth out a run, and for me personally, basically saves me from spending half my time rerolling. The cultural shift through time is a fresh concept. Play is a lot more reactive to the currents of the evolving world's history. In that sense, it's the furthest from Civ. One could opt to become whatever culture suited their surroundings or circumstances, which is arguably how things worked in real life. The Phoenicians wouldn't have been a maritime people without the Mediterranean, and you wouldn't pick them without a sea of your own. I'd recommend Humankind, if nothing else, as a new experience in the genre, with the assurance that it's from a studio that knows what they're doing when it comes to fresh strategy. And if you like it and also like space/fantasy, I might even suggest Endless Legends, a game they made with their own lore and world and all. The end point I want to emphasize is that this is a game where, despite my nitpicks, I'm excited to see where they take it from here. This video is set up, more or less, for the fact that I'm going to be making a series going forward that's talking about academic historical concepts using games as a medium to explain them. Other than that, if you're new here, maybe consider subscribing for that or for other content I have or will have. I've got a video on Dark Souls right now, which is weird and interesting, and I've got a relatively popular video on the CIA and their collection of abstract expressionist art. Maybe check one of those out. I don't know. Bye.